To the south of the Damascian Argent Mountains rests a small farming village known as Travail. It was here that a girl named Riven was born, but to no family. Her father had been a soldier who was slain in a nameless battle, and her mother passed as a result of the girl's stubborn birth. This village, located in the forgotten corner of Noxus, was everything its mother state was not. Quiet, tedious, and uneventful, a stark contrast to the Noxian ambition. Left to work the Travailan farms as an orphan, Riven longed for a sense of family, specifically a sense of acceptance. A longing she saw could be fulfilled in the brother and sisterhood of war. Taken in at an early age by warband conscriptors, Riven was more than fit for combat after years of labour on the land. Impressing her superiors would prove to be easy with her exceptional capacity to work and physical strength. Despite only being in her teen years, Riven could already wield a longsword taller and even heavier than herself. Capturing the attention of the generals, Riven joined the Fury Company, an expert group of Noxian soldiers, making especially close bonds to three war sisters, Tenef, Arel, and Marit. Riven would become a weapon of Noxus, one that was forged alongside her sisters in the intense heat of battle. Pledging her strength to the militaristic empire, she thrived off the resolve of those around her and finally felt like she belonged. She finally had a family. Her patriotism, coupled with her competence on the battlefield, allowed her to gain further recognition, even extending to acknowledgement from the Grand General of Noxus himself, Borom Darkwill. But in the shadows, the General was piecing together a plan. Recognizing a tool that could be harnessed, Darkwill rewarded Riven's alignment to the Noxian cause with a weapon of war, a colossal dark steel blade that was imbued with runic energy by a sorceress of his advisory, Leblanc of the Black Rose. Not privy to his counsel, Darkwill was planning an invasion to the east, to the spiritual and peaceful land of Ionia. Unlike the expansionist Noxus, Ionia was an intrinsic state, seeking harmony and union between land and inhabitants alike. Unbeknownst to the Ionians, Noxus had already begun making its first moves with spies disguised as merchants. Infiltrating the First Lands, their job was to scout out points of weakness and abuse the trust and placid nature of the friendly locals. Through the relayed intel, Noxus had set its occupancy effort in motion, sending heavy resources to the western coast of Ionia, to the shores of Navori province and the Phalor Island. Thought to be a peaceful and weak country, however, Ionia wasn't giving an inch. Led by the newly appointed captain, Zan Irelia, the Ionian warforce, treacherous landscape and magics of the people bore ceaseless resistance to the Noxian effort. Elsewhere, a Piltovan chemist known as Singed had been gaining notoriety from the development of his alchemical weapons. As he was vocally opposed to Piltover's growing usage of hextech, Singed was ridiculed and kicked out of the University of Piltover, stemming his resource flow and consequently his weapons research. This forced him to become desperate for funding to continue his developments, so he headed for the Piltovan criminal underbelly Zorn. Shortly after, when he was offered by Noxian warlords to develop a weapon, he had little to consider. Looking to use his outsider knowledge to finally break the Ionian defences, an ambitious Noxian commander, Emiston, personally employed Singed to create a weapon of genocidal magnitude, expansion no matter the cost. After a lengthy stalemate against the Ionians, the Fury Company was to escort another warband through Navori. Led by Commander Emiston, the Noxians were tasked with testing the new chemical weapons. The Fury Company's job was to get the escort to its point of effect safely. Normally one of unwavering obedience to the cause, ceasing at no kill nor question, Riven couldn't help but feel something was off about this mission, and as if her unease wasn't enough, the resistance from the enemy wasn't letting up. Unfamiliar to the Ionian weather, a sudden rainstorm caught the Noxians off guard, stranding both parties in a brutal mudslide. Emerging from the surrounding landscape, an Ionian ambush bore down on the warbands. With no way to retaliate and no way out, Riven called to Commander Emiston for help. In a thrash of rain, mud, comrades and enemies alike, she thought the call couldn't be heard, until she noticed a faint glowing light descending from the ridgeline that overlooked the battle. As if in slow motion, a single flaming arrow punctured the cargo of the escort wagon. A piercing hiss cut through the battle sound, like a gas bottle that had just broke its valve. Instinctively, Riven raised her greatsword in front of her body. Chemical flames erupted from the wagon, ripping through the battle and engulfing everything it touched. Protected by her runic magic, Riven could do nothing but watch helplessly as the almost demonic flames immersed her entire field of vision, devouring the only people she had called family and her foes in a sweeping blanket of death. The chemical fire explosion was over in a flash, leaving in its wake a toxic mist that was so potent any who breathed it in were met with a burning far harsher than any the fire could have inflicted. A gruesome, melting mess of writhing Ionian and Noxian soldiers lay bare for Riven to witness, still protected by her runic magic. Almost as if she was awakened, the true intentions of Noxus were suddenly apparent. There was no cost too great. In an instant, the utter annihilation before her had crushed her heart, beliefs, and ideals all at once. Racked with guilt and betrayal, Riven fled the battlefield, still unable to process what had just happened, the only remnant being the sword that had saved her life. With no stomach to serve a nation that had betrayed her and her only family, Riven abandoned Noxus and began to hate the blade as it was the only thing that still remained of her past allegiance. She desperately tried to shatter the sword, but its runic potency was too strong and it couldn't be broken. Left to ponder her guilt and wander the unfamiliar land, Riven was purposeless and haunted. Eventually, she came across a small village near central Ionia. As was the way of the Ionians, she was greeted with open arms, the locals providing refuge. A Windblade master by the name of Elder Suma took a particular interest in Riven and her weapon, that he would come to learn was a shackle of her guilt. Wanting to teach her as much as possible, Elder Suma took her in, showing her the ways of his Windblade techniques. Still fueled by an intense ambition to sever her ties to the past, living day to day in an almost hypnotic delusion, Riven tried to cast the battle and the loss it carried out of her mind. Finally, the Windblade Master was able to successfully break the blade as per Riven's wishes, and she watched as the steel she hated so much shattered in an explosion of violent runic magic. However, there was no solace to be found in the broken pieces, intensifying Riven's feeling of helplessness and crushing her consciousness under the weight of her sin. Still in a maddened state, Riven scrambled to collect the pieces of the blade, all except one that she couldn't find. Using the runic explosion from the sword as cover, Riven fled the village without even a word to the Elder. Feeling no atonement or severance, the sword was still her weight to carry. What would bring her peace? A question that weighed on her mind as heavily as the loss of her brothers and sisters. Overwhelmed with a feeling of guilt, Riven left into a self-imposed exile as she had much to atone for. After enough time had passed and with nowhere else to go, Riven returned to the same village. There, she was taken in by a pair of Ionian farmers, Arsa and Shava Conte, who were stricken with the grief of losing their two sons to the brutality of the Noxian War. Unable to bear a grudge, the farmers were forgiving of the Noxian and refused to live in grief. They could sense her remorse and saw her now as their adopted daughter. Looking to help those who had shown her love and acceptance, Riven worked the fields and learned the ways of the Ionian people. However, her presence still caused some unease, and certain members of the community could only recognize her as an outsider. So naturally, when a village elder was found dead, Riven was a prime suspect. Under this suspicion, Riven was taken in by Ionian soldiers and learned that the elder that had died was the same one who had shattered her blade. Under the watchful eye of the council and jury of the village, Riven's allegations were laid out for her. Adamant that her daughter was innocent, her mother Shava spoke up, accusing a recently disgraced swordsman of the village, Yasuo, as the murderer. When Ionians discovered the elder dead, Yasuo was nowhere to be found, which painted a very guilty picture. Murmurs in agreement broke out among the observers. Growing up, Yasuo had been nothing but trouble, and his reputation in the village was shaky at best. As a final query into Riven's innocence, her shattered blade was brought out and laid before the council. Every piece of the blade except one. While examining the fractured pieces before him, a small man passed through the crowd with his hand in his robe. He was the adept of the village, a preparer of bones and remains for burial once an Ionian had passed. As he approached the center of the courtroom, the judge's gaze was fixed on him, and the crowd looked on in anticipation. The man slowly unveiled a swathe of cloth from the pocket of his robe that draped over a small object. He approached the bench as he unfolded each wing of the swathe, revealing a piece of sharp, dark steel. The judge questioned what the adept was doing, to which he responded that when he was preparing Elder Suma's body, he had found the steel in his neck, the only evidence that could have caused his death. Intrigued, the judge picked up the piece of the dark steel and ran his finger across its sharpest edge. His eye passed from the steel to the tip of the sword where a vacant hole remained and slotted the piece back where it come from. The courtroom filled with a unified, resonant gasp from the onlookers, but, realizing what had happened when the Elder broke her blade, Riven's "I'm guilty" was louder. She stared at the now completed blade. Suddenly, a familiar energy filled the atmosphere around her. The black runes of her sword began to glow green and energy flowed between the pieces, sparking with a familiar, violent instability. The sword began to hum with increasing intensity before coming to a splitting crescendo. Riven, at the top of her voice, commanded the courtroom to get down. Everyone in the room leapt to the floor or used whatever they could for cover. In a runic explosion of steel and energy, the whole room was blitzed. The piercing sound of the explosion was only matched by the screams of the Ionians. Through some kind of miracle, there was no injury, except the courtroom that now lay in shambles. The Ionians all rose to their feet, with every gaze fixed on Riven, who was scanning the room lest she had to add another dead to her guilty conscience. After collecting himself and checking to make sure none were injured, the judge brought the room to order. The entirety of the village was just witness to the power Riven's blade possessed, but also to its instability. Her parents, who were so sure of her innocence, began to sob, only able to stand through the support of the others' embrace. The judge closed the hearing, announcing they were to decide an appropriate punishment in the coming day while Riven was shackled to the courtroom wall. The observers and Shava, who was too overcome with shock and uncertainty, left for the day, leaving Riven and her father in the trial room alone. Not long after the last observer had left, Asa ushered over to Riven, who was slunk against the wall battling her conviction. Despite the evidence laid out in the courtroom and his daughter's admission to guilt, Asa retained that he was certain of her innocence. With such assurance, he unshackled Riven. In unison with the shackles hitting the stone floor, another cling of steel rang out in the trial room. Riven jerked upward, her only thought to protect her father. Her trained and soldier-like alertness brought her attention to a hooded figure entering the room, the tip of their blade scraping the floor behind them. Slowly looking up at her, the hood that once shrouded the figure's face revealed a man with a scar that spanned from cheek to cheek over the bridge of his nose. Asa knew who it was, the man his wife had accused of being the murderer. It was Yasuo. Yasuo, like Riven, was a student of Elder Suma's wind techniques and had been assigned by the council to be his personal bodyguard. As the war crept closer to the village, Yasuo's fellow students and brother Yone were tasked with meeting the enemy forces while he was to protect the Elder. Hearing war drums nearby, Yasuo was frustrated that he was the only one left in the village while his brother and fellow students risked their lives. Against orders, Yasuo left to join his comrades, only to return and be met by Ionian spears and handcuffs. The man he was meant to be protecting, Elder Suma, was dead. Accused of the murder, Yasuo fled, searching for a way to prove his innocence. Upon learning there was a foreign Noxian girl in his village, he sought to return as he sensed a way to clear his name, only to be met by the one he had wished to avoid the most, his own brother, Yone. Morally bound to return his brother to justice, Yone had set out to look for him. With complete belief in Yasuo's conviction, the two drew their blades. After a heated exchange, the duel was over in a flash, with Yasuo cutting down his older brother in self-defense. Now, seeking vengeance, he had returned to the village to challenge Riven. Her guilt was his innocence, and he wasn't going to let his brother's death be for nothing. Unveiling the hilt piece of Riven's broken blade beneath his cloak, Yasuo thrust it towards her in a trail of sparks across the courtroom floor. Faster than she had anticipated, he lashed at her. Suddenly recognizing the imminent danger, Riven squeezed the hilt of her weapon and the pieces of the blade flew into the room in a whirlwind of runic magic, tripling the size of the broken sword in an instant. The two leapt at one another, clashing with the full power of their blades. The clang was resonant and the swords locked. Recognizing the similarity between their techniques and Riven's lack of murderous intent, questions began forming in Yasuo's head. Harnessing the power of the Elder, Yasuo channeled wind into his katana, which surged forth to meet Riven's shattered blade at full power, ripping the tip piece from the sword that had taken Elder Suma's life. As if shot from a rifle, the piece exploded from Riven's sword, flying in the direction of her father who was watching from across the room. In an instant, Yasuo reacted, leaping across the room faster than the wind and slicing his blade in front of Asa as if to open a rift. A violent gale spewed forth, forming a wall of wind, and the dark sliver of steel came to a complete stop, hitting the ground. Realizing the volatility of the runic blade's energy, it became apparent that Riven hadn't meant to kill the Elder, and she too was battling with a past too painful to bear. Hearing the commotion, a mass of Ionian officials and soldiers led by the judge burst into the courthouse, just barely witnessing the end of the exchange. It was after seeing the instability of Riven's runic magic and Yasuo's disposition to save innocent life rather than take it that the Ionian officials departed, suddenly unsure of the outcome of their decision tomorrow. The following day, the officials and villagers convened in the shell of the courthouse. Riven stood before them, ready for any sentence that would help her atone for the past. Her father and mother watched on from the stands in anxious anticipation. Wishing for no more bloodshed, Riven was sentenced to years of servitude to the village, beginning with the reparation of the courthouse and mending the devastation the Noxian War had caused. Yasuo was granted a pardon. Riven revelled in serving her family and the village, finally living in peace and getting a chance at repentance for the damage she had caused the people who had taken her in. One afternoon, Asa was to go to a neighbouring village for farming supplies, and he asked Riven to accompany him on the road. What better protection than a trained warrior who wielded a sword bigger than most humans? While on their way back, a sudden jolt in the cart Riven was sleeping in woke her up. She sat up sleepily to see her father engaged in a conversation with an older Ionian woman. Riven could faintly make out her features through the light cast by a flickering fire that was lit next to the road. The woman, known as Muramat, was a mender, an Ionian capable of feeling the energy of things and binding broken pieces. After introductions over a meal, Muramat asked to see Riven's blade. While tracing the runic patterns on the steel under Riven's careful watch, it began to hum, and Muramat suddenly collapsed. Once she finally came to, she explained to Riven and Asa that she'd seen a vision through the runic magic. Someone was coming for her sword. Without a moment's hesitation, Riven and Asa made haste back to the village. But despite the old woman's revelation, months passed. Normal, uneventful months. On a normal morning, as Riven prepped the field for a day of work ahead, her father shakily made his way over to her. His head was down, and Riven could see tears gently rolling down his cheeks. Asa took Riven's hand and looked up at her. The tears did not stop, but his solemn expression turned into a warm smile. Shava had died in her sleep, succumbing to her age. Still bearing the pain of losing yet another family member, Riven made her way onto the field to let her calloused hands distract her from the ache in her heart. As she stopped for a break, Riven looked up at the sky and took a deep breath, silently thanking her departed mother for a second chance. Gripping the tool to continue her field work, she focused to unearth a rock that was in the way of the plough on a crop line, but this focus was interrupted as Riven heard a familiar rhythmic thumping. Looking out across the field, Riven's gaze was met with a small party of Noxian soldiers. They'd come for her. Riven raced inside and told her father to hide. If the Noxians were to discover Asa, they may use him against her. As they came closer, Riven was unable to comprehend what she was seeing. It was her sisters from the Fury Company, Marit, Arel and Teneth, with two others she didn't recognise. Walking back to the middle of the field, she felt her lungs tighten in anxiety. After a reconciliation with her sisters, Riven learned one of the party she didn't recognise was a young squire, Aerith. The other woman leading the group was Tifalengi of the Black Rose, a formidable rune mage who answered only to Leblanc herself. It was then that Tifalengi made her intentions clear. Leaning on a runic blade of her own, Tifalengi announced that Riven was to return to the capital to face punishment for abandonment. While the terms of her imprisonment were being explained, the squire Aerith was looking around for Riven's sword. Only able to find shards of the blade in the barn, Aerith looked under the house in the cellar. On accident, he found Asa hiding and presented him to Tifalengi outside, along with the dark steel shards he had just found. Aerith was unable to present the blade itself, but his discovery of Asa was enough for Tifalengi to force Riven's hand. If she did not bring her the blade, Asa would die. Aerith, watching on, couldn't believe his discovery could cost this innocent man his life. Riven, who would rather die than let harm befall her father, went into the house to retrieve the sword. Tifalengi, growing impatient, revealed the group weren't there for Riven at all, but only for the runic blade, the weapon of Noxus. To them, she was a dispensable traitor and would die, along with her father. Riven's war sisters, shocked at this revelation, disputed against Tifalengi, who said if they didn't help her kill Riven, they would die alongside her. To this threat, Marit, the masked sister, sided with Tifalengi. Gripping the hilt of her broken sword, runic energy began to fill the blade and the pieces Tifalengi was holding ripped through her fingers to rejoin the hilt, leaving her hand bloody. As the air filled with the crack of unnatural energy and the scream of the rune mage, a fight ensued between the masked Marit and exiled Riven. With her fully formed sword and her father's life on the line, Riven slayed her sister, pinning her to a tree with the massive blade. After an extended and heartbreaking fight, an exhausted Riven is shocked when the rune mage tore the hilt from her grasp with magic. In retaliation, both Arel and Tenef charged at Tifalengi, sensing it would be their sister's demise if they did not. Now possessing both runic blades along with her powerful magic, the sisters were helpless as Tifalengi suspended all three of them in the air with a prison spell. Knowing they were dead for treason, a sense of helplessness washed over them. They had lost. Tifalengi, with all three suspended in the air, sentenced them to death. Riven closed her eyes, accepting her fate. Maybe this will lead her to peace. Suddenly, she hit the ground, springing to her feet in a daze. The spell was broken. She looked up to check on her sisters, but their gaze was fixed on what was in front of them. Aerith, the squire boy, had plunged his sword through Tifalengi's back, driving it out through her chest and heart. Shocked, Riven, Arel, and Tenef watched as the rune mage's body slid off the blade and crumpled to the ground. Recognizing he had unknowingly sided with a greater evil, Aerith had made a decision. This wasn't the Noxus he knew. Despite what had happened, the sisters couldn't return empty-handed or they too would be sentenced by Noxus. They had no choice. Not wanting them to bear her punishment or put her father at further risk, Riven agreed to return, much to the objection of Asa. Upon returning to the capital, the party claimed Tifalengi was lost to Ionia, but their captive was there for sentencing. Facing the Noxian war court, Riven was to serve a life sentence at the Fleshing Arena, a common form of gladiatorial entertainment run by Draven, the glorious executioner of Noxus. But Riven's tale doesn't end there. Hi everyone, I'm Rival. I just wanted to finish this video off with a personal thanks to you, the viewer. This project was almost 9 months in the making, so it means a lot that you take the time to check it out. Two particular thanks I have to make go to Eric Cloud, who did the editing, animation, and effects. This wouldn't be possible without his creative vision and hard work, and I really look forward to creating more with him in the future. And the second is to Rover Studio, the team behind the amazing art. They were an absolute joy to work with and really made the vision I had for this video come to life. They took every directive decision and went above and beyond. There was even a point in the process where the team was working around natural disasters, so my gratitude to the team can't be understated. Rover is a freelance studio, so if you are ever wanting to have your own characters drawn up in this style, or maybe one of the others that they excel in, I've got their contact links in the description below. And one last thing I'd like to add. This project was funded solely by me, and I'd love to do more. So if you enjoy this type of content, the best way to support it is through the channel Patreon. On it, you can subscribe to tiers that give you access to phone and computer wallpapers of HD art from this video, as well as a PDF of the art in an actual book format. On top of that, if there was a certain champion or lore storyline you'd like me to explore, certain tiers give you suggestions and voting rights to make your voice heard. The link to the Patreon will be in the description as well. But with that, the most heartfelt thank you I possibly can conjure up, and hopefully I'll see you in 2025 for more projects like this. Bye!